Okay, what were these events of the past week? Well, one very ominous event was the bank run and collapse of the Spanish bank called Banco Popular. All right, a classical bank run occurred on this Spanish bank, and there are many other similar conditioned banks, particularly in Spain, Portugal, and Italy and Greece, that are in the same shape because, 8 years later, after the crash of 2008-9, the European banking system has not been restabilized for various reasons, which I cover in a chapter in my book, which comes out in a couple of weeks, called Central Bankers on the Ropes, Monetary Policy in the Next Depression. European Central Bank, the ECB, did not, and Europe did not really clean up the bad debts on their banks. They let them languish there for 8 years, and in fact they got worse in 2011-12 when Europe had its double-dip recession. They've never cleaned them up, and part of the reason is that the ECB is not really, and has not been, at least initially here, a central bank in the true sense of being able to bail out other banks, central banks, and banks in the Eurozone. We're talking about the Eurozone here, not the Bank of England, and those countries that have their own central banks outside the Eurozone, like in Scandinavia. But slowly the European Central Bank has very, very slowly evolved towards a true bona fide central bank, but it still is not a true bona fide central bank, a chapter of which I dedicate there in the book. So we have, this Banco Popular collapse here last week, and it was sold off to another Spanish bank, Santander, for €1. Yes, what's a bank run? A bank run is when depositors, in this case what we call retail depositors, people who just put their savings and checking accounts in the bank, realize that the bank is about to go belly up and they run down. That's why they call it a bank run. And they take their money out, which means it's certainly going to collapse. But runs occur and collapses occur when the bank no longer has sufficient funds to give those who come and claim and want their money. Why is that? Because all of capitalist banking is based upon a system called fractional reserves banking. These banks hold only just a pittance of the money that was actually deposited in them. In the U.S., what is the fraction that's really held by the banks? Oh, I would say it varies with the size of the bank and the bank branch, but well under 10%, maybe under 5%. Some banks have small banks have virtually no reserves on hand, and larger banks in big cities maybe have 5% on hand. So they loan out everything that's been given, deposited, because that's how they make their money. In other words, you put your money in and they give you a few percent, if that. Now you don't even get that, right? And then the banks loan it out at much higher rates. It's called the spread. And that's one way they make a lot of money. Right? And that's what's been happening for 8 years now. The banks are paying you and I in your savings and checking accounts and CDs and so forth, less than 0.1% probably. But they're taking that money and they are investing it, investing it offshore, investing it to institutionals financial institutions that speculate in stock and bond markets and foreign exchange markets and derivative markets, right? And make double-digit returns. And the banks make maybe 6, 7, 8%. So they pay you less than 0.1%. They loan out 6, 7, 8%. They themselves also invest in these stocks and bonds and securities markets and all the other markets out there and make a lot of money that way. Well, this has been going on for 8 years, since 2010. We've had near zero interest rates. And in fact, less than zero if you adjust it for inflation. the banks get to borrow for free. And the banks then either put that money back in the Federal Reserve. When I say borrow, I mean borrow. Banks borrow from the Federal Reserve. You and I can't, but banks can. Shadow banks can. They borrow from the Federal Reserve, and then they do this process of paying, loaning out at higher rates, you see. And in the U.S., the Federal Reserve actually pays the banks interest. In other words, you can go borrow from the Federal Reserve, or federal funds rate between banks, which is determined by the Federal Reserve until 6 months ago at virtually 0.1% from the Federal Reserve, and then the Federal Reserve says, okay, you want to park your money here, leave it with us. After you borrowed from us, or you borrowed from another bank at 0.1%, you can put it in the Federal Reserve, and we'll pay you, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, will pay you 0.25%. Right? So you borrow money and just let it sit, and you make money off of that. Yeah, that's been going on since 2009, 2010 in the U.S. Anyway, back to Banco Popular. What's happened here is people realize the bank is about to go belly up. So what do? They run down and they say, give us our money out. But it doesn't have any money to give out. It's loaned it all out, or it's, invested and so forth here and there. And it can't sell the assets right away, so what happens? Well, the bank goes bankrupt as a result. And you can have these what's called retail bank runs. In other words, retail means average depositors like you and I, your checking and savings accounts and so forth. A commercial bank is a retail bank, takes deposits. But then there's all kind of banks that aren't retail banks, like shadow banks, investment banks, and so forth. And their depositors are the super wealthy and super rich institutions, corporations, right, that invest. That's the difference between an investment bank, shadow banks, and depositor commercial banks. But the two have blended. Commercial banks act like shadow banks, like JP Chase, is really engages in shadow banking kind of activities, and vice versa. Some of the biggest shadow banks now are acting like banks. So the lines blend quite a bit. And talk about blending, news last week of Amazon. Amazon's becoming a bank. Yes, Amazon's now going to loan to people. Right, this is you can borrow loans from Amazon. This is part of this whole peer-to-peer networking stuff, crowdfunding or whatever you want to call it, where non-banks are getting into banking functions. This poses some big problems for central banks that are supposed to supervise and regulate banks. When banks are no longer, quote, banks, but non-banks acting like banks, how does the central bank supervise them and make sure they don't do things that end up in financial instability? Well, that's another problem, but it is a problem. Okay, so Banco Popular collapses, and the European Central Bank arranges a purchase of Banco by the other big bank in Spain, Santander. Arranges. What does that mean? That means it enables and authorizes Santander to buy Banco for €1. In other words, gives it to Banco. Now, we did that in the U.S. too, back in 2008 when the investment bank Bear Stearns collapsed. What happened? The Federal Reserve stepped in and did a deal and virtually gave the bank, Bear Stearns, to JP Chase. Yeah, virtually. How much? Well, $2 billion. Chase got to buy Bear Stearns for $2 billion. But the Federal Reserve gave a $29 billion loan to Chase to buy the bank for $2 billion. And the bank just, Bear Stearns just 3 months earlier was worth, over $100 billion maybe. Its building in New York City was worth more than $2 billion. So, the Federal Reserve cuts the deal with a big private bank, Chase, and turns over Bear Stearns to Chase. Capitalists gobble their own. They eat their own all the time, right? They're cannibals. Capitalist banks are cannibals, economic cannibals. And the federal government plays ball with them and enables them to do so. We have more concentration, meaning fewer big banks than we ever had before. And part of the problem is the banks are too big to fail, as they say, and that means the government has to always bail them out. And that was a good example, Bear Stearns. Anyway, parallels between Banco Popular and Bear Stearns. Another thing that needs to be added here about Banco Popular is that people aren't aware, but the money you put in the bank is not your money anymore. Once you put it in the bank owns that money. Yeah, that's their money. And they can do what they want with it, including if there is a bank run and you go down and the wells and you say, I want my money out, what the government and the banks can do is say, no, we're not going to give you your money out. What we're going to do is give you, exchange it for some Wells Fargo bank stock. Yeah, we're going to convert your cash to bank stocks, and we're going to give it to you in stocks. That's called a bail-in, and that's coming next time. It's already been piloted, bail-ins, by the way, in Europe, in Cyprus and elsewhere. They had their banking crashes a few years ago. And the U.S. and the U.K. have already developed plans for bail-ins next time. Bail-ins, yes. There may be a cutoff point. In other words, if you have less than maybe $50,000, you won't be bailed in. You won't have your cash exchanged for stock. No one knows what the cutoff point will be. It depends on the size of the bank and the degree of the crisis. But some people will have their cash, their investments, converted to stock. Now, the stock's going to be worthless virtually when the bank has to be bailed out, you see. How are banks bailed out then? What's the typical process that leads up to a solution, as we just described here in Banco Popular and Bear Stearns, where another bank is brought in to purchase it, and the government subsidizes the purchase? Well, typically, if a bank is in trouble, the central bank calls on the bank to raise more capital. Capital in this case means money, cash, money capital, liquid capital, right? If it raises more capital, of course, it can pay out more to people who are demanding their money. Let's assume it's a commercial bank, and want to take it and run. Right? So raising more capital issues is the key. The bank in trouble can, issue more stock in that sense. That will raise capital. Or you could have a group of other banks get together, a consortium, it's called, and they put money into a pool for, the bank in trouble. Of course, the bank in trouble will have to pay back someday, but, a consortium, an emergency a loan collected by the other private banks. Okay. The central bank can also engage in what's called stress tests and accounting gimmickry. The stress tests and gimmickry are designed to make it look like the bank is not really in that bad a shape, so buyers of the stock will step up and purchase the stock, and the bank can raise capital. Right? Stress tests, and they're phony. Stress tests are phony. We won't go into the details in this show, but stress tests were created in 2009 by the Federal Reserve, and what the Federal Reserve does is create a scenario of a crisis and gives that scenario to the banks, and the banks then reply as to how they would survive that scenario. And, of course, they're going to survive it. They're going to manipulate the numbers to look like they survive it well enough. And then the Federal Reserve Central Bank decides, oh, okay, so your solution to this scenario convinces us, and you're good, right? Or the Federal Reserve will make this subjective determination. No, we don't believe your numbers. You're not good. Do something else. Sell off some more of your assets. You see, that's another way that a bank in trouble before it's bailed out is addressed. Right? Sell off some of your best assets. That's what Citigroup did after the 2009-10 crash. It consolidated and shrunk. It sold off some of its better properties and businesses around the world because it expanded too much. So selling off assets to raise cash, to raise capital, right? Issuing stock to raise capital. Given a consortium loan is capital, and stress tests and other accounting gimmickry is created to justify and make it look like the bank's okay. You can John Q. Public, you can buy some of the stock. Accounting gimmickry also takes a role here. What do I mean by that? Well, in 2009, banks were in deep doo-doo in the U.S., and we had the stress tests, and then we had also Congress, particularly the House Banking Committee, led by Barney Frank, and what they decided was, it's okay, banks, you can lie about your condition. What did that mean? That meant you could suspend mark-to-market accounting. What was that? That was, okay, tell the truth of how bad you are, mark-to-market. And what Barney Frank in Congress, a big liberal, Barney Frank said was, okay, you guys can lie. You can suspend mark-to-market. Well, that makes them look better, doesn't it? And encourages people to buy the stock. Because the stock has collapsed. Oh, it looks like the government's stepping in. We have stress tests. They don't look that bad. And okay, let's buy the stock, raise capital. Or sell off your assets, right? And if it gets bad enough, if that's not sufficient to, quote, rescue the bank, then the government will step in and buy off the bad loans. In 2009, it was mortgage loans, subprime mortgage loans and treasuries and so forth. That's called QE, quantitative easing, where the bank prints money and doesn't raise it from taxes, prints the money electronically, and goes and buys those assets, takes those bad assets off of the balance sheets of these banks and puts it on its own Federal Reserve balance sheet. That's why today the Federal Reserve balance sheet is $4.5 trillion. That's one way of pumping liquidity into these private banks in trouble. There's other ways as well, but that's a direct way, you see. And then the government can the central bank rather, can either hold those bad loans on its own balance sheet, as I said, or in some cases in Europe and elsewhere in the past, what they've done is take those bad assets and put it in a wholly government-owned, what they call bad asset bank, right? And then slowly over time, the government sells off those bad assets as the prices begin to rise sometimes, and they sell them off cheap, in other words, not at full market rates, to other capitalists who want to buy the loans because they know they're rising again. Right, so they subsidize other capitalists at their own expense. So let's call it a bad bank solution. Or the government can just buy preferred stock and debt from these institutions like AIG in 2009-10 actually happened. The government bought and held these bad assets, right? Okay, so that's how those various methods are the ways in which banks are bailed out, right? In the very extreme case, if the government doesn't want to buy the bad assets, in other words, like the Federal Reserve has a rule that the assets of the bank, it has to have some good loans as collateral for buying it out. If that doesn't work, then of course they will either allow the bank to collapse, as they did with Lehman Brothers, or they will arrange a consolidation of the bank, as they did with Washington Mutual, bank back in 2008-9. And that's exactly what they did with Banco Popular here, right? But the problem is, even if Banco Popular has been rescued, the problem is, what signal does it take, does it send, rather, to the rest of people, depositors in Europe, that, well, gee, Banco Popular collapsed. Maybe my bank will collapse too. We don't know yet. There are a lot of banks in Europe that have trillions of dollars of non-performing bank loans. In other words, they loaned out all this money during the boom period, and the borrowers went bankrupt, collapsed themselves, or can't pay, and haven't been paying principal and interest on these loans, and these loans are sitting there on bank balance sheets, like Banco Popular, right, or Monte dei Paschi in Italy and other Italian banks, right, or Banco Novo in Portugal, so forth, sitting there, just sort of, swamping the whole system. How much in Europe? Well over $2 trillion. $2 trillion for 8 years sitting there, just poisoning the whole banking system. And they haven't cleaned it up, you see. They haven't cleaned it up. And now we got Banco Popular collapsing. And what does this mean for people thinking about in Italy and Portugal, elsewhere, that, gee, sure, they got bailed out, but maybe we ought to quickly go and get our money out, especially since it's clear that the European Central Bank has decided that bail-ins is a useful tool, and they're going to use it. They already used it. We better get our money out. Well, let's watch closely what happens here to the banking system. That situation is partly why the European Central Bank decided last week as well to continue its quantitative easing program. In other words, it's going to continue to buy tens of billions of bonds every month. I think the number is 60 billion euros of bonds, $66 billion every month. In other words, it's buying up these bonds, even from good banks. In fact, most of the bond buying is from banks and investors in Germany and elsewhere who don't really need to sell these bonds. And they start with government bonds held by private sector, buy them back. But they're running out of them, so they start buying corporate bonds. And in Japan, not just corporate bonds, they're running out of those. They're buying stocks of companies. And they're buying derivatives of various kinds from real estate and ETFs and so forth. So what you got here in the 21st century is central banks, quasi-government institutions, that are supposed to act like government institutions, but they're really acting like private banks. They're buying up these securities, stocks, bonds, and so forth, propping up these companies. They're pumping money into these companies. More and more of them are not able to survive in the 21st century global capitalism, but they're subsidizing them. They're buying them up. That's like an investment bank, a private equity firm, right? Central banks are becoming like private equity firms, buying up companies. Wow, what's happening here? Well, this is part of the evolution of 21st century global capitalism going on the financial side. So the ECB, realizing the situation in Europe is not still all that well, and all this talk about recovery, that's all hype, that's all expectations of maybe there will be a change in the direction of the economy, which isn't going to happen.